Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Thomas Brenner traded city chaos for lakeside peace, he expected quiet nights and grilled steaks, not false 911 calls, forged documents, and a neighbor waging war. But when power-hungry Karen sets her sights on his home, he fights back the only way he knows how, with evidence, strategy, and grit. I bought the house on a cool spring morning, the kind of day when the air smells like wet earth and new beginnings. The place stood at the edge of a quiet lake, a two-story wooden house with a wide porch and just enough creaks in the floorboards to remind me it had history. After years working as an investigator chasing white-collar criminals, I wanted silence, a place where I could breathe without the buzz of fluorescent office lights. The previous owner sold it directly to me. No middlemen, no HOA nonsense, and the title company confirmed every inch of it was mine. It felt like freedom. I unpacked slowly, taking the time to hang my favorite frame maps and set up my home office by the large bay window facing the water. I remember thinking how perfectly isolated it was. A few neighbors scattered around, the nearest road a 5-minute walk through the trees. By the first weekend, I was still living out of boxes, but decided to reward myself with a proper steak on the grill. The smell of hickory smoke mixed with the damp breeze off the lake. That's when I first noticed her. A woman in a crisp white blouse stood just beyond the low fence separating my property from the next lot. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't even pretending to be curious. She simply stared, her arms folded, like I was some intruder who had stolen her view. When I waved, she didn't wave back. She just turned and walked away. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe she was one of those neighbors who thought hello was a dangerous word. By evening, I had my porch light on, a beer in hand, and nothing but quiet for company. At least until the sound of sirens broke through the night. A police cruiser pulled into my driveway, lights flashing, scattering the shadows across the yard. My first thought was that something had happened nearby. But when the officer approached with one hand resting on his holster, I realized the call was about me. "Sir, we got a report of a possible break-in at this address," the younger officer said, scanning the house as if expecting masked burglars to leap from the porch. I blinked, then laughed, which probably didn't help my case. "Break-in? I own this house," I said, fishing out my wallet. "Just moved in this week. Want to see the deed? The keys?" My voice was calm, but I could feel that familiar investigative instinct kicking in. Who called this in, and why? The older officer, with a face like weathered leather, stepped forward, taking a slow look around. "Can we take a look inside?" he asked, though it was less of a question and more of a routine check. I led them in, showing my still half-unpacked living room, the boxes labeled in my handwriting, the stack of purchase documents sitting on the coffee table. They seemed satisfied within minutes. The younger one apologized, even muttering something about probably a neighbor misunderstanding. When they left, I stood on the porch watching the red and blue lights fade down the road. I couldn't shake the image of that woman staring at me earlier. The call had to come from her. Who else would care enough to dial 911 because a guy grilled a steak on his own property? Maybe she was just paranoid, or maybe she didn't like new faces around here. I decided not to think too hard about it. After all, this was supposed to be my escape from all that suspicion and drama I dealt with in my old job. The rest of the night was uneventful. I locked the doors, checked the cameras I'd installed, a habit from years of gathering evidence, and sat back with another beer. Yet something about that visit stuck with me. Maybe it was the way the officers looked slightly embarrassed, as if they'd been duped. Or maybe it was the memory of her eyes, cold and measuring, like she was already planning her next move. I told myself I was overthinking, but even as I drifted off to sleep, the low hum of unease stayed with me. The next few days were quiet enough to lull me into thinking the first incident was just a misunderstanding. I spent the mornings unpacking and the afternoons sanding the porch rails, letting the smell of fresh pine take over the air. By the third evening, I felt almost settled. I'd even started to enjoy the rhythm of the place. Coffee at sunrise, lake breeze through the windows, a steak or burger sizzling on the grill at dusk. It was during one of those evenings, while I was trimming the hedges near the driveway with my portable speaker, humming some old blues tracks, that I noticed the same woman again. She stood by her fence, phone in hand, looking at me like I was staging a crime scene rather than cutting branches. I pretended not to see her and went about my business. 15 minutes later, I was interrupted by the now familiar flash of red and blue lights. A different set of officers pulled up, their expressions tight, as if they'd been told to expect trouble. One of them, a tall guy with a square jaw and a buzz cut, asked, "Sir, are you hosting a party?" I blinked at him, then gestured at the empty yard. My tools were scattered on the grass, the grill was still cold, and the only guests I had were two stubborn squirrels fighting over an acorn. "No party," I said evenly. "Just me, my hedge trimmer, and a playlist." The younger officer glanced at his partner, clearly annoyed. "We got a noise complaint. Caller claimed there was a large gathering with shouting and loud music." He paused. "Obviously, that's not the case." I could feel irritation rising like heat under my collar. "I think I know who's calling. My neighbor. Older lady. Blouse with some HOA logo. She's been staring at my property since day one." They exchanged a look that said they'd heard similar stories before. The buzz-cut officer shrugged. "If this continues, you should file a harassment report. We can't stop her from calling, but false reports can have consequences." Once they left, I leaned on the porch rail, staring at the spot where the woman had been. She was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided enough was enough. That evening, I walked around the fence line and found her in her backyard, clipping rose bushes with surgical precision. "Evening," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. "I'm Thomas Brenner. Just moved in next door." She looked up slowly, as if my name offended her ears. "I know who you are," she replied, voice cold and sharp. "And I know that house. It was never supposed to be sold outside Hickory Heights." HOAI tilted my head, trying to make sense of her words. "The house isn't under HOA rules. I bought it directly from the owner. Title company confirmed everything." She snorted, setting down her clippers. "That property has always been part of our community. The previous owner and I had an agreement. She promised I'd get first rights if it was ever sold. This sale wasn't approved by our board. Frankly, you're trespassing in a home that shouldn't even be yours." I almost laughed, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't joking. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm the legal owner. I have every document you could ask for. I'm not going anywhere." Her lips tightened into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she said, turning away and muttering something about community standards and illegal occupancy. I walked back to my porch, feeling a mix of irritation and disbelief. It wasn't just that she was wrong, it was how absolutely certain she seemed, as if the entire neighborhood revolved around her authority. I made a mental note to print extra copies of my deed and keep them ready, because I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The following 2 weeks turned into a surreal circus, and I was the unwilling star of the show. It started with another police visit, this time in the middle of the night. I had just finished reading on the porch when a patrol car screeched into my driveway, spotlight glaring into my face. The officer said there had been a report of suspicious activity, something about men carrying tools and trying to break in. I was the only one there, in sweatpants, holding a cup of tea. I showed my ID and deed for the third time, and the officer shook his head in frustration. "We're getting a lot of calls from the same number," he muttered, glancing toward the neighbor's yard. He didn't say her name, but I didn't need him to. I could practically feel her eyes on me from behind her curtains. 3 days later, another call, this time claiming there was smoke rising from my property. I was grilling ribs. 2 police cars showed up, along with a fire truck. The firemen were more amused than anything, but I was seething. I could imagine her standing on the other side of her fence, sipping iced tea, smugly watching me explain myself again and again. By the 5th false report, something about suspicious movement inside the house, when I was pacing during a phone call, I realized I couldn't let this slide any longer. If she wanted a fight, she'd get one, but it would be on my terms. I began documenting everything like I was back on a case. Each visit from the police, every ridiculous claim, I logged with dates and times. I spoke with the officers and asked them to file incident reports, even if they seemed trivial. Most of them were sympathetic. A few were outright angry about the waste of their time. One of them, Officer Jensen, advised me to install more cameras and keep evidence of her harassment. "We can't charge her yet, but this is looking like malicious misuse of 911, he said. "Stack enough proof, and it'll stick." Meanwhile, the mail became another battlefield. One morning, I found a letter in my mailbox stamped with the Hickory Heights HOA logo. It demanded that I cease unlawful occupancy and submit a request for community approval to continue residence. The letter was signed by none other than Karen Mitchell, self-appointed queen of my misery. It was laughable. My property was outside their jurisdiction. The HOA had no legal say over me. Still, the tone of the letter was threatening, hinting at legal consequences and community enforcement actions. I tossed it into a folder labeled Evidence. A few days later, I discovered that she wasn't content with just bothering me. She was poisoning the well with the neighbors. A friendly couple down the road who had waved to me before now avoided eye contact. When I stopped to say hello, the husband awkwardly mentioned that Karen told us there's some shady stuff about your purchase. Apparently, she'd been circulating a rumor that I'd tricked the previous owner into a fraudulent deal, that I was some kind of house squatter. It would have been funny if it wasn't so malicious. I decided to confront the narrative head-on. I printed copies of my deed and title documents and showed them to the few neighbors I trusted, including a retired firefighter named Hank. Hank frowned and shook his head. "She's been running this HOA like a fiefdom for years," he said. "Most folks just let her do her thing to avoid trouble. You're the first one to stand your ground, and she doesn't like that." His words didn't surprise me, but they gave me clarity. This wasn't just about me. Karen was used to bullying everyone in her line of sight, and now she'd met someone who wouldn't fold. I wasn't planning on being anyone's victim. I ordered additional cameras, set them to cover every inch of my property, and programmed them to upload footage directly to a secure cloud. I also started recording every interaction with her on my phone. She wanted to play dirty. I'd build a case strong enough to bury her in her own lies. By the start of the third week, I was done playing defense. If Karen thought she could keep needling me into submission, she'd picked the wrong guy. Years of working economic crime cases had taught me that the best counterattack isn't just louder yelling, it's quiet, meticulous evidence gathering, and I was good at that. I began my morning with a trip to the county records office, asking for every document related to my property, from its original construction permits to its current boundaries. The clerk, a tired woman in glasses who clearly hated HOA drama, handed me a fat stack of files. "You're definitely not in their jurisdiction," she said flatly. "Your lot isn't even on their maps." I made copies of everything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table under the warm glow of a single lamp, combing through the documents. It didn't take long to find something strange. An old dispute from 7 years ago, when Karen had tried to claim this same house as part of Hickory Heights. The case had gone to small claims court, and the judge had ruled against her, stating that the property predated the HOA by decades. I nearly laughed out loud, so this wasn't her first rodeo. She'd been obsessed with this house for years, and I'd walked right into her crosshairs. I didn't stop there. I made official requests for the HOA's meeting records and notices from the past decade. While most of them were banal, discussions about lawn lengths and holiday decorations, I found multiple mentions of Karen pushing for annexing nearby properties to expand the community. My house was mentioned by address, as if she thought persistence would somehow rewrite history. It wasn't just petty harassment. She had been scheming to absorb my land for years. 2 days later, I got my first direct evidence of her tampering. One of the official notices she'd left in my mailbox had what looked like the previous owner's signature, only she'd died last year. I called a friend of mine who still worked in document forensics, sent him a scan, and he confirmed what I suspected. "This is forged," he said. "Sloppy work, too. The stroke order's all wrong." That was enough to cross the line from annoying to criminal. While digging into all this, I started building alliances with the neighbors. Clara, a single mother living 2 houses over, told me Karen had once threatened her with $500 in fines for painting her fence a non-compliant shade of beige. Another neighbor, Hank, the retired firefighter, confessed that Karen had left warning notes about his unapproved mailbox ornament. They were tired of her, but nobody wanted to confront her. I told them I was gathering evidence. Clara's eyes lit up with a mix of relief and vindication. "If you take her down, I'll back you up with whatever testimony you need," she said. It wasn't long before Karen noticed my new confidence. One afternoon, while I was installing another camera on my front porch, she appeared at the edge of her yard, holding her tablet like a shield. "Recording everything now," she sneered. "You're not going to intimidate me with your gadgets. The board will have you out of here by the end of the month." I didn't answer, just smiled and kept tightening the screws on the camera. That seemed to unsettle her more than if I'd yelled. Bullies hate silence. Later that night, I uploaded all my collected documents and footage to a cloud drive, labeling folders by date and incident. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my home and showing her that her fake authority stopped at my fence line. I sent copies of the forged HOA notices to my lawyer, along with the footage of police visits. He called me back within the hour. "This is harassment, plain and simple. And the forged signature, that's criminal fraud. We'll file the paperwork." As I shut down my laptop, I felt the first spark of control return. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was setting the stage for a fight she couldn't win. The day Karen tried to storm my front steps, I knew the gloves were off. It was early afternoon, and I was working on sealing the deck, brush in hand, when I heard the sound of heels clacking on my driveway. I turned to see her striding toward me with a folder stuffed under her arm, her face set in that mix of entitlement and forced civility I'd come to recognize. "Mr. Brenner," she announced, "we need to talk about your ongoing violations." I set the brush down slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. "Violations," I repeated, keeping my voice flat. She opened the folder like a magician revealing a trick. Inside were several papers covered with HOA letterheads. I could see my address typed in bold. "As president of Hickory Heights HOA, I am informing you that your occupancy of this property is unauthorized until our board completes a compliance review. I strongly advise you to vacate the premises until this matter is resolved." I couldn't help but laugh, and the sound seemed to stun her. "You do realize none of this has any legal weight, right? I am not in your HOA, never have been. You can't just invent jurisdiction because you want my house." Her expression hardened. "These documents are official notices. I will escalate this if you don't comply. The board has the authority to enforce community standards, and you are making this neighborhood less safe with your attitude." I held up my phone, already recording. "Karen, this is harassment. You've called the police 5 times in 2 weeks, all for nothing. I have your forged letters. If you think you can intimidate me, go ahead. The camera is rolling. Say hello." Her lips pressed together, and she hissed through her teeth. "This is far from over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Then, like a bad soap opera villain, she spun on her heels and stomped down the driveway, muttering into her phone as she went. That was the moment I decided to hit back hard. I called my lawyer, Michael Pearson, a bulldog of a man with a voice like gravel and zero patience for petty tyrants. "She's crossed into criminal territory," I told him, sending over the videos and copies of the forged HOA notices. He didn't hesitate. "We'll draft a cease and desist letter today, and I'll file for a harassment complaint. Keep documenting everything." Later that evening, I installed the final set of cameras around the property. One pointed directly at the fence line where Karen liked to lurk. I posted a bright yellow private property video monitored sign at the front gate, just to drive the point home. Hank stopped by as I was finishing, holding a 6-pack. "Saw her storm out of your yard earlier," he said. "She looked like she'd swallowed a wasp." I chuckled, but I could feel the tension building. "She's not done yet," I told him. "She's the kind that pushes until someone pushes back harder." And sure enough, the next morning brought another escalation. While I was grabbing my mail, I noticed a white envelope wedged under my doormat. Inside was a final warning notice from the HOA, but this one was bizarrely aggressive. It claimed I had unauthorized structures on the property and threatened to initiate legal seizure if I didn't comply. It was signed by Karen, but the signature didn't match any of her previous ones. I recognized the tactic. When people start faking legal authority, they get sloppy. I called Michael and sent him scans. He laughed darkly. "She just gave us Exhibit A for fraud." That same day, I saw Karen pacing near my fence, talking to 2 men in polo shirts, probably other board members. I could hear snippets of conversation, words like example and non-compliant outsider. I turned on the sprinkler system, deliberately soaking the edge of the lawn where they stood. They left in a hurry, but not before Karen shot me a look that could strip paint. By the end of the week, we had filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff for harassment, presenting every police report and fake HOA notice. Officer Jensen came by to confirm the paperwork. "She's digging her own grave," he said. "Keep your cameras on. If she trespasses again, call us immediately." That night, I reviewed the latest camera footage. At 2 a.m., someone had walked up to my front gate and tried the latch. The night vision video showed a familiar silhouette. Karen herself holding a flashlight. I saved the clip, time-stamped it, and sent it to Michael. If she thought this was her territory, I was about to prove her wrong, one piece of evidence at a time. By the next week, the tension had hardened into something almost electric, like the air before a storm. Karen had gone quiet. Too quiet. No calls to 911, no passive-aggressive notes. It wasn't relief I felt, but a sense that she was planning something uglier behind the scenes. My lawyer, Michael, warned me that this was the point where people like her either back down or double down. Given her personality, he said, I'm betting on the second. His prediction was dead on. 3 days later, I found a county inspector standing in my driveway with a clipboard and an apologetic look. Sir, we got a complaint about unpermitted structures and possible zoning violations, he said. I invited him in, and within 5 minutes, it was clear the complaint was baseless. Everything on my property, the deck, the shed, even the fence, was built and documented years ago. When I asked who filed the report, he wouldn't say, but we both knew the answer. As he left, he muttered, "We've been getting a lot of these ghost complaints from this neighborhood. Some people just don't have enough to do." I spent the afternoon going through my camera footage, and sure enough, Karen had been out the night before, taking photos over the fence like a paparazzi stalking a celebrity. I emailed the footage to Michael, who replied with a single line, "This is perfect. We'll use it in the harassment case." But Karen wasn't satisfied with government complaints. That weekend, Hank came by with news that made my jaw tighten. She'd been distributing flyers around the neighborhood, claiming I was a fraudulent homeowner, that my deed was under investigation, and that my property would be reclaimed by the HOA. I knew exactly how dangerous lies like that could be if left unchecked. I spent Sunday afternoon walking to every house on the street, calmly explaining the truth and handing out copies of my purchase documents. Some people nodded sympathetically. Others looked wary, clearly afraid of crossing her. Clara, however, didn't hesitate. "I'll testify against her if it comes to that," she said firmly. "She's bullied everyone for years." On Monday, I decided to take a more aggressive step. I filed an official records request for all recent HOA communications, and what I found was damning. Karen had been sending emails to her board members claiming that my house was improperly sold and would soon be repossessed. She even attached fake legal notices with forged letterheads. Michael's voice practically hummed with satisfaction when I showed him the evidence. "She just handed us her own noose," he said. That night, as if on cue, Karen made her boldest move yet. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with an alert from the motion sensor on my backyard camera. I opened the live feed and saw her creeping along my fence line with a flashlight, her face pale and intent. She was snapping pictures of my garden shed like it contained state secrets. I didn't even hesitate. I dialed the sheriff's office and told them I had a trespasser. Yes, my neighbor. Yes, that neighbor. By the time the deputies arrived, she had retreated, but the footage was crystal clear. The deputies reviewed it on my porch and shook their heads. "This is more than harassment now," one of them said. "We're filing a report and recommending a restraining order." The next morning, Michael and I met to draft the paperwork for both a cease and desist and a temporary protection order. "She's escalating because she feels cornered," he told me. "But once the court sees this mountain of evidence, she won't be able to wriggle out of it." I spent that night watching the sunset from my porch, cameras rolling and security lights on. It felt less like living in a home and more like holding a defensive line. But unlike her, I had patience and strategy on my side. The game was about to shift, and I planned to be ready for every move she made. The restraining order came through faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, the county judge reviewed the footage and incident reports and signed off on a temporary order that prohibited Karen from stepping anywhere near my property or contacting me in any way. When the deputy delivered it to her door, I watched from my porch as she read the paper with a face that shifted from shock to fury in a heartbeat. She shouted something unintelligible, slammed the door, and vanished inside. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that she'd finally realize her crusade was over. But with Karen, it was never that simple. The next day, I caught her testing the limits of that order. The footage from my front camera showed her walking right up to the property line, phone in hand, like she was waiting for me to give her an excuse. When I stepped outside, she started yelling about illegal fencing and pending board action, as if the restraining order didn't exist. I didn't bother arguing. I simply called the sheriff's department. 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up, and 2 deputies escorted her back to her driveway, warning her that she'd be arrested if she crossed the line again. But she couldn't leave it alone. That evening, while I was cleaning up the kitchen, the motion alert went off on my back porch camera. I checked the live feed, and there she was again. This time, stepping onto my property, waving a thick envelope stuffed with papers like it was a sword. I didn't even go outside. I called 911. By the time the deputies arrived, she was standing on my porch, yelling through the front door about community rights and illegal occupation. The officers didn't bother with warnings this time. I watched as they cuffed her, read her rights, and walked her to the back of the cruiser. Her face was flushed, eyes wide, but even then she was muttering about saving the neighborhood. As they drove her away, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I dealt with criminals who tried to scam millions out of banks, but I'd never met anyone so utterly convinced they were entitled to something that wasn't theirs. It was beyond stubbornness. It was obsession. The arrest opened the floodgates. Local news crews showed up the following day, curious about the HOA president who got arrested for harassing a homeowner. I refused interviews, but Hank and Clara didn't hold back. They told reporters about years of her harassment, fines for imaginary violations, threats to call authorities for untrimmed lawns, even rumors she'd slashed someone's Halloween decorations for being unapproved. By the end of the week, the HOA board was scrambling to distance themselves from her. A letter showed up in my mailbox, signed by 2 board members claiming that Karen's actions do not represent Hickory Heights HOA, and apologizing for any trouble. I laughed and dropped it into my evidence folder. Meanwhile, Michael was building a civil case against her, combining charges of harassment, defamation, and property interference. We included every false 911 call, every forged letter, and every clip of her trespassing. "She's looking at serious penalties," he said during one of our late-night calls, and given the media attention, the county prosecutor might file criminal charges on top of this. I wasn't celebrating yet, but I finally felt like the tide was turning. For the first time since I moved in, I could sit on my porch with a beer and not feel like I was under siege. The cameras still hummed quietly, recording everything, but now they felt like a symbol of control rather than desperation. Karen had crossed every line she could, and the law had finally caught up to her. Karen's arrest was only the beginning of the final chapter. Within days, Michael confirmed that the county prosecutor had filed multiple charges against her: harassment, false reporting, trespassing, and forgery of legal documents. The case was no longer just about me. It had become a public spectacle. News vans occasionally parked on the street, filming segments about the HOA president who went too far. I tried to ignore them, but every time I stepped outside, I could feel the ripple of curiosity from the neighborhood. Hank joked that I was a local celebrity now, though I would have preferred peace and quiet over fame any day. The first court hearing was a circus. Karen showed up in a tailored suit, trying to project the image of a misunderstood community leader, but her composure cracked when the prosecutor rolled out the evidence. The video of her pounding on my door, the nighttime footage of her sneaking around my property, the fake HOA letters with forged signatures. Claire and Hank both testified, describing how she had bullied and intimidated residents for years. Even a couple of board members spoke out, admitting they had been afraid to challenge her authoritarian grip on the neighborhood. When I took the stand, I kept my testimony straightforward. I described every 911 call, every false accusation, every moment I had to explain to the police that I was not a criminal, but a homeowner defending what was rightfully mine. I could see Karen fidgeting in her seat, glaring at me with barely contained fury, as though she still believed this was all some elaborate mistake. But the evidence spoke louder than either of us. By the time my lawyer wrapped up the presentation, the jury's expressions told me everything I needed to know. The verdict came after only a few hours of deliberation. Karen was found guilty on all counts. The judge was merciless, handing down a sentence of 6 years in prison with no chance of early parole, citing her pattern of malicious behavior and blatant disregard for the law. As the bailiff led her out in handcuffs, she turned her head toward me, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she still couldn't comprehend that she'd lost. I didn't feel triumph, just a profound sense of relief. For the first time since moving in, I knew she wouldn't be back. The fallout was immediate. Hickory Heights HOA, already crumbling under public scrutiny, was formally disbanded within a month. County investigators found that several board members had turned a blind eye to Karen's forged documents and harassment campaigns. A few were fined, while others resigned in disgrace. Hank told me the neighborhood felt like it could breathe again, like someone had lifted a heavy curtain of fear that had been hanging over everyone for years. I received a settlement for damages, covering my legal fees and compensating me for the emotional stress she'd caused. Michael insisted I could have pursued a larger claim, but I didn't care about the money. I just wanted my life back. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt the sense of home I'd originally come here for. I invited Claire and Hank over for a barbecue, and for the first time, my property didn't feel like a battleground. The lake shimmered in the evening light, and the quiet I had once dreamed about finally returned. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about Karen, about how convinced she was that she owned not just her property, but everyone else's lives too. It's a mindset I've seen before, the kind that grows from unchecked power. But here, at my house by the lake, that chapter is closed. I stand on the porch with a cold drink, watch the sunset burn gold across the water, and I know this: no one will ever dictate what happens on my land again.